Hello, everyone, and welcome to a last edition of the week on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in to today's show. Hope you all enjoyed the start of the NFL season last night. Fascinating game between the Chiefs and the Ravens came down to the last play of the game. Really enthralling, especially in terms of fantasy perspectives. So if you have any opinions about that game, feel free to leave them in the comments. But before we get into some of the more exciting business pertaining to this weekend's games in both the NFL and in college football, if you are so a fan of that, we do have some for all those last-minute stragglers in your fantasy football drafts, draft or pass series, if you are pondering who to target and who to avoid should you be drafting anytime soon. As we get down to the nitty-gritty of the NFL season, we have two wide receivers. We also have a little segment where I try to decipher how to pick and value different defenses in fantasy football, because a lot of people might overlook the defenses. So it should be an overarching, fascinating segment to end the week, fascinating show to end the week. But before we get into all of the excitement and hype surrounding today's show, I do want to remind you all to consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network as a whole. Everything you do for both the shows and the networks are greatly appreciated by all. If you haven't already, make yourselves available to the many features that we have to offer on YouTube now that we are a live show. The Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features will do just fine. Tips and donations are included in that as well. So if you do feel so inclined, consider leaving that. It is one of the best parts of my show. I love interacting with you, my faithful audience. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, opinions, trades you might want to get analyzed, waiver wire advice, anything, leave it and feel free to do whatever you want outside of that as well to appreciate the show and the network as a whole. In return, we appreciate you for all you do for it. Without further ado, let's jump right into today's show. Let's start off with some draft or pass segments, and then I promise we'll get to some more exciting segments at the end of today's show. I know you're chomping at the bit to talk about betting, talk about some fantasy as well. But before we get into that, for all of you last-minute drafters out there wondering who should I pick up, these segments are for you. My first draft or pass segment of the day lies in an interesting situation. This receiver is one I've truly loved and has truly gone under the radar. As someone who has had consistently dominant seasons, hasn't really had a QB that he can rely upon for many of them, but this year might be different. I think this team as a whole that he's on is going to be one of the sneakiest teams. Maybe not in terms of getting a playoff berth, but they are going to surprise a lot of people and potentially put up a lot of points this season. They're going to be in a lot of shootouts, and this guy might just be the X factor in all of that. So without further ado, let's talk about the draft or pass status of Terry McLaurin. Now, Terry McLaurin is one of those players who I really think fits so well into the offense he's in right now. Because when I look at how the Washington Commanders have evolved to this point, how they've gotten here, they've really revamped how they thought about the offense. They've really decided to hone in on one kind of image of a number one wide receiver and then supplement him with other pieces. Because let's say they were going into the season with both Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson. This could be a very different story that I'll be telling you. But now in the absence of Jahan Dotson, even though they have a lot of pieces that excite me, they bring in Zacchaeus from his exploits with the Falcons and Eagles. They bring in Luke McCaffrey through the draft. Ben Sinnott, an exciting young tight end. They also signed Zach Ertz. They still have Brian Robinson Jr. They added Austin Eckler. All of these pieces are really complementing not just Jaden Daniels, who will be their new rookie QB, but they believe that Terry McLaurin's the star of the show. So all the pieces that are surrounding him are more in terms of supplementary pieces than, overwhelming the targets that Terry McLaurin will garner in this offense. Because now I can see him with, the absence of a true wide receiver too, even though there were a lot of good depth behind him. He is now the true wide receiver 1 in the system. So let's talk about how some of his stats from last year might translate to better stats this year. He did have 70-plus catches, 1,000 yards in each of the past 4 seasons. He was wide open, actually. This is an interesting stat on 16% of his routes last year. However, it did not necessarily translate to fantasy production. He was the wide receiver, 29 overall. This year, he's projected to have 123 targets, even though last year he had a career worst yards per target with 7.6 and yards per reception with 12.7, and 27 more wide receivers scored more fantasy points than him. So it did look dire last season, but I don't necessarily think it was all his fault. This year, I think the offense will be primed for him to really have an explosive year where he becomes the true star. Because last year, a lot of different issues befell the Washington Commanders, whether it be the inconsistency of Sam Howell, whether it be the inconsistency of the O-line, whether it be because kind of the forced offensive scheme. I think this year there will be a lot more clarity. And it might seem weird because of all the pieces they added, how all of them will fit together. But I do know one thing, Jaden Daniels will really appreciate having a guy like Terry McLaurin there, because he is a wide receiver 1 who's just so versatile. He can get down the field vertically, can run a lot of different routes, can be used in many different ways. He doesn't necessarily even have to catch the ball. He doesn't even necessarily have to score. He just can manipulate the field in so many different ways, and I'm excited to see how he pairs with Jaden Daniels. So I think the main reason why a lot of people might not want to draft him is because there could be a hidden gem on the Washington Commanders offense. I'm not saying that Zacchaeus or McCaffrey are going to be overwhelmingly fantastic this year, but I'm just saying that a lot of people might be skeptical about what the Washington Commanders did this offseason by adding so much depth. As Shepisi Sweet Spot says, how about likely on waivers? Yes, thank you for this comment, Shepisi Sweet Spot. A comment that pertains to last night's game. As I said, if you are interested in talking about last night's game, I would be up for it. How about likely on waivers is the question. I love him. I love him as well. And if we saw last night's game, you saw how much he really became almost like the tight end 1. Now, it could be because Mark Andrews was so busy trying to occupy Kansas City defenders and was used as a blocker to kind of supplement what was a shaky offensive line performance for the Baltimore Ravens. But I still think that Isaiah Likely is an attractive option on waiver wires. Fantastic question. He did have, I believe, 80 yards, that one long touchdown. Could have had another touchdown there at the end of the game to tie it up. A toe away from a 2-touchdown performance for him. That's a fantastic question. If you have any more questions pertaining to the Chiefs-Ravens game last night, feel free. But let's get through Terry McLaurin's draft or pass segment as well, because I think Terry McLaurin's going to be an interesting piece. So let's talk about how he fits into the profile of the wide receivers and how this Washington Commanders offense really kind of fits the bill of how they're going to perform. So, like I was saying before, the supplementary pieces, I'm not saying they're fascinating. I'm not saying they're so good that they could take away some and eat into Terry McLaurin's targets. But I am saying that a lot of people might be skeptical that, well, with all the activity that the Washington Commanders did on the free agency market and picking up all these guys, they really think that Jaden Daniels is someone who can not only get down the field vertically, but can operate in a functional NFL offense with so many different weapons. With Austin Eckler in the backfield, they get him experience. With Zach Ertz at the tight end position, they get him experience. And with Terry McLaurin, they give him a true wide receiver 1. But when I look outside of that, I'm not necessarily worried about the other weapons. Maybe I'm worried about, say, Zach Ertz potentially getting a lot of red zone targets, or Austin Eckler and Brian Robinson Jr. having a say in the passing game out of the backfield. But at the end of the day, there isn't necessarily really anyone to kind of take away from what Terry McLaurin can do. He's a fascinating vertical threat. He's a fantastic route runner, high intelligence player, can make any catch, can really catch any ball that Jaden Daniels is willing to throw down the field because of his catch radius. And this year, I kind of feel like is the year where people will start to respect him more. Maybe he goes up different tiers in the kind of tiered view of the wide receiver market in fantasy terms. So that being said, draft Terry McLaurin. If you haven't done your draft already, Terry McLaurin is a fascinating option. I wouldn't take him in, say, the early rounds, like rounds 1 through 4. Maybe like he warrants a 9th, 10th round pick when you're trying to fill out your bench. Spot start kind of guy. And have to see how the rapport between him and Jaden Daniels develops. But he is an interesting prospect. That being said, I don't know how weird this Washington Commanders offense is going to get with all of these diverse weapons and pieces that they have. So it's really going to come down to if, as Tap to Learn says, who's the top option moving forward in the KC receiving core? Another fantastic question about last night's game from Tap to Learn here. At the current moment, I would say it's Rashee Rice, but it's just so versatile, this KC receiving core. I was really impressed with every single wide receiver in KC's receiving core, from Rashee Rice to Justin Watson even. And I was especially appreciative of all the route concepts that Andy Reid was able to run with these guys on the offense. But that being said, I think Rashee Rice is just the most versatile. I think Mahomes trusts him the most out of this wide receiver core. Went to him early and often on crossing routes, slant routes, really just getting Mahomes in a rhythm. But that being said, Xavier Worthy is a bad man. He can get down the field. We saw how speedy he was. First touch in the NFL, first touch as a Texas Longhorns fan. I'm telling you, this guy is not just speed and verticality. He's a route runner. He's a very intelligent player. There may be concerns about drops, but last year with Texas, he did improve in that category. So look for him to be a nice weapon. But right now, to answer your question firmly and confidently, I think Rashee Rice profiles. Who knows? Maybe Marquise Hollywood Brown can be nice. Juju Smith-Schuster I don't necessarily think is going to ascend up the rankings all of a sudden. But overall, Rashee Rice seems like the most confident, competent wide receiver in this receiving core. So fantastic question about last night's game. And a question that will take us into our first break. Coming up next, we will be doing another draft to pass. I promise you guys we'll be getting into the excitement of betting previews and talking about tonight's game and some Sunday games. But we have another draft or pass segment about a rookie wide receiver who's entering an offense as perhaps a very daunting approach. We'll be right back to talk about who that is right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.